This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
And welcome to this evening's seminar where we're going to be discussing classical reception in contemporary women's poetry. And tonight with us we've got McAlpine and Tiffany Atkinson. So what we're going to do is we're going to start the day off with a short intervention from each of the two poets. And then we're sort of going to open the discussion up to everybody else, so, which will be chaired by Maria. And sort of towards the end, we'll just sort of have a general round-up, some concluding questions. And don't rush up at the end, because Richard has been successful in his endeavours to go find us some more wine, so we better reward him by drinking all of it. So I'll just hand over to Maria, and we'll get started with everything.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Ruth, and I think it seems an opportune moment right at the start to say how impressive it is that Ruth and her colleague Francesca, who couldn't be here today because she was unwell, have established this whole series, of which this is the second session on women writing the classics. And how splendid it is to see that there are so many women who are writing the classics, and tonight we are looking at poetry. So we're going to have our two speakers in turn telling us a little about why they engage with classics in this way, and perhaps reciting a little of their poetry, and then we will open it up to discussion. And you will see that Ruth and Francesca have kindly provided on your sheet some general suggestions of potential themes. You can break away from those if you would like to ask, any other sorts of questions. You'll also see that Ruth has been so organised as to have small biographies on the handout. So I will only just briefly introduce our speakers, additionally our poets, I should say, in addition to the comments that I've made here. So we're going to start with Tiffany Atkinson, who is Professor of Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia. And it's interesting that both our poets are embedded in academic institutions, so I'd be interested to hear from them how their creative writing interlinks with their teaching of literary studies. And Tiffany has published widely, including receiving a number of prizes. I think Catala et al. Was the TLS Book of the Year at some point, in 2011, presumably. And so it's with great pleasure we invite her up now to introduce her engagements with Catullus to us. Thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you. I was wondering what to do seating-wise. If I sit, will that be all right?
Yes, I'm sure it would.
Of things to, yeah, that would be great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about this work, which, I mean, now feels, it doesn't feel, fresh anymore. So it was very interesting. Well, no, I mean, shoot myself in the foot right from the start. It came out in 2011. It's not my latest book, so it was quite nice to sort of go back to it and to think again about, in the context of women writing classics, what I was doing, what I thought I was doing, and what maybe I was actually doing in the collection. So I'd like to say a little bit about how I came to this and my kind of oblique way into being a woman writer, drawing on an element of classical tradition, and then to read some poems in a kind of annotated way. So hopefully I can explain a little bit more about the larger themes, if you like, of the collection by actually looking at some specific poems. Catala et al. Was my second collection, and my first was very different, and this was important it's maybe an important point to begin with, because part of what I was doing when I came to Catullus as a source text was trying to find a different direction. And if I may, I'm not going to read from this first collection, but I would like to read the blurb that the publisher wrote for this first collection, because hopefully it will give you some sense of the kind of identity as a writer that I was actually trying to get away from by the time I came to Catulla. So this came out in 2006, and what they wrote on the back was the poems of the debut collection, Kingdom Particle, offer us multiple perspectives from a woman on the brink of 30. Oh God, that was a long time ago. This crucial birthday is a milestone from which the speaker looks back to childhood experiences, to the indulgent pleasures of the 20s, and then onwards to a mysterious future. The poet's style is often an apparently casual throwaway vernacular that nevertheless has been formulated with great care. The effect is of intimacy, as if in a letter from a friend, and offers an immediacy, a diary-like quality of authenticity, and so on. Which I actually had a slight problem with, because actually this book is mostly fictions and personas, and yet the publisher, and this is not a criticism, clearly wanted to market it as poetry by a young woman about being a young woman, as if it were in some way kind of authentic, like natural speech and so forth. So when it came to thinking about a second collection, I was very keen to do something else, but also perhaps in some way to do something that in a way said, and this is a retrospective thing, I didn't really feel this at the time, but I think using an element of classical tradition and making an adaptation was something to do with saying, this is a mask, this is a persona, this is the kind of writing this is. I am perfectly able to use personae and masks and distance and so forth in my writing. I can write poems that are more flamboyantly aware of their fictionality and their artifice, or something like that. It seemed to be important. And moreover, if there was some way in which I could have examined the lyric form and the expectations of the lyric form, that was also what I was looking to do. This was all before I even had the first inkling of what this book would be. In terms of speaking from an academic tradition, the problem, if it's a problem with that, is that you're kind of expected, to an extent, to talk about your creative work as though it would come about as a kind of seamless result of research. You know, that you'd had this idea beforehand and you'd sort of systematically worked backwards from an end point, and that was what the creative writing process is, and it's not. In fact, my sort of encounter with Catullus is entirely an accident, but I think that story in a way is better from the point of view of a living classical tradition, you know, that it's something that one can just, it stumbles across one's path. You don't necessarily have to set out with a particular academic intention. And the occasion was a reading by a poet called C.K. Stead. And if you go to lots of poetry readings, you'll know that there comes a point where you sort of start to zone out, and no matter how good the poet is. And then he started to read some poems from a sequence called Catullus Again, and they were fantastic. And I sat up and I thought, I have to buy that book, but also I have to read Catullus. So that's what happened. And then I found a collection of Catullus translations in a bookshop, a local second-hand bookshop, and that was that. So it was a kind of series of fortuitous things that first of all brought me into collision with Catullus via another adaptation, and then gradually led to the evolution of a sequence, or they're not really a narrative sequence, a suite of poems that make up half of this collection. So in short, I'm going to be talking about the Catulla poems. Catulla is a female speaker, as you might expect. She's partly contemporary, partly set in sort of late Republican Rome. Actually what interested me most when I started the writing wasn't the gender switch, actually. It was that sense of, first of all, a kind of palimpsest of time periods, not having to be contemporary, not having to be now, and also the mode of address, and a kind of an ambivalence that comes from a what to the modern gaze, contemporary gaze, is a kind of unembarrassed, fairly strident voice, which was a great pleasure to experiment with. So that's kind of how I came to Catullus, and actually once I started the poems, they then began to sort of generate a life of their own, but it certainly wasn't a case of systematically seeking to adapt or translate. And in fact, the poems are extremely tangential. They get more tangential as the sequence progresses. In one of Josephine Balmer's books, she describes Anne Carson saying of her own versions of Catullus, my versions of Catullus bear about the same relationship to translation as Francis Bacon's do to mugshots. Francis Bacon's paintings do to mugshots. He says they are very close, which is interesting. So they're kind of, I don't know what to call them, interventions, transpositions, maybe something like that. So my first poem is the one that perhaps most closely echoes two of Catullus's actual poems, and it's the one where the speaker announces herself. Announcing herself very much as a fictive persona, I suppose, but also introducing, in a sense, a cast of characters. So, like in Catullus, Catulla is a speaker who has a sort of unrequited love, who's called Rufus, and this is where she addresses him. It's the first poem in the collection. And what I particularly enjoyed about this was that it was a kind of declaration of awkwardness and embarrassment, and I've spoken about embarrassment and irrelevance in the context of this sequence before. The thrill was not having to resolve the ambivalence, to keep that kind of utter ambivalence of hating and loving in place without having to resolve it in any way, which comes across most in the last line. Catulla. Well, Rufus, here's a talent for the inappropriate, to make the tawdriest suburban dogger blush. And after all these months as single as a bar stool. It's not enough that you look less at me than at a passing bicycle, but still I make a case for you. How suddenly you so surpass the local streaks of piss, my friends ring all the haddock-handed lads and hit the pubs without me. I must hear how you leave women fired like bows in hotel rooms across the city. Yet despite myself, I keep my health. I will grow old. A clever woman wouldn't die of feelings, nearly. Love, I wish you were ridiculous. Best you never meet my friends who, in their cups, would tell you how I starved for weeks and wandered through the streets in borrowed dresses, bless, aflame for an encounter. Dear God, may you never know how slow, unlovely women burn, nor how we keep our heads down. Sod you. All the books say I must break this at the stem, live long, die happy. Take these petals as they come, for kisses, curses, kisses. The second poem was, again, very closely aligned with the sequence of Catullus's 116 poems, and this is only a handful. It's the very famous address to Lesbia's sparrow. So the kind of conceit there is the proximity of the little birds to the absent lover, and all kinds of innuendo and sort of slightly whimsical sort of innuendo about pecking and stroking and things like that. In this version, Catulla speaks about Rufus's dog. And I like dogs, so it was kind of no hardship. I mean, but I also kind of the reverse gaze that the female speaker, obviously to have written a Catullus perspective from a male perspective would have been to engage in what's very livid, misogynistic perspective. And there was something that I obviously had to keep negotiating in what the female speaker would do, but I did want her to return a direct gaze, not an insinuating gaze, but a very directly kind of erotic gaze in some way. And so in this respect, the dog, I wanted the dog to function sort of as the sparrow does, and for it to be well aware of what it's giving away. Rufus's dog. So it takes the whole poem to imagine his dog. The dog was in his study when he called, and no commandment she can think of takes a stand on the imagining of dogs. Across the rug it yawns with Heimlichkeit, a muscled bag of half-warmth. Just his fingers, where the skull collects the spine's cords, lift the muzzle's blunt love. But that's animals. Crossbreeds, she knows, are fickle when it comes to instinct. Over rolls this demijohn of fealty, open as a palm. Exquisite, how the skin takes touch. The eyes roll back. The universe contracts. And she observes the soft jewels of the genitals, for she is known for thoroughness. It's an oldish dog, but not dead. In the pistons of the hips lie all the casual cruelties of fuck. She sees the outraged neighbour storming from her kitchen with a bucket of cold water. Get that madhound off my Mitzi! Awkward teacups afterwards. The Wunderkind, a pup's some brutal husband, dunks into the rain butt. All the bevels of his no-good boyo head against her knee. His steady heat as dreaming tears him over plains. Where the ribcage clasps a wolf's heart. People thinking she's the cat sort. The more I read and reread Catullus in translation, I hasten to add, although I did have a Latin copy where it was really to look at the construction of the verses and how they were put together in the original, but I don't read Latin. The more I read, the more it was actually the difference of the Catullus world that interested me, that seized my imagination, and not very often I find that Catullus is spoken about in terms of kind of relevance. Oh, he could have been writing today, or oh, he looks like a modernist, he writes like a modernist, or that there's a kind of emphasis on accessibility, but it wasn't that I enjoyed. It was very much a difference that I didn't want to assimilate. And I later found Alice Oswald writing about her adaptation of, well, it's not even an adaptation, her take on Homer in Memorial. And she wrote something that I think is relevant. She's about the otherness of Homer. And she wrote, what draws me back is this bright strangeness, this sense of being looked at by otherness. A bright strangeness, a sense of being looked at by otherness. And it was the being looked at that I also found very suggestive in Oswald's account, because it isn't a one-way glance. There is a sense that I feel in this kind of adaptation that the gaze goes both ways, that kind of friction, that slight uncomfortableness is not merely us looking at a text, but it's how the text, if you like, is reading us or trying to read us. And again, it's something that I kind of wanted to be present in the way I thought about writing my own versions. So what started out as an experiment then gradually became something more, in a sense, loosely systematic, in that I had gradually, as Catullus does, a cast of characters, and I had a setting, gradually the poems began to emerge out of that collision. And also, at the same time, I became more interested in form and thinking about, I suppose, how the lyric tradition is also an interrogation of the rhetoric of desire, how desire is constructed in fictional forms. And then I noticed that there's a lot of scholarly work about who Lesbia was. Was she Claudia Metelli? Was she Claudia somebody else? And in a sense, I don't know that matters in a reading of Catullus, because you can equally read these poems, and maybe this is a modern, a contemporary eye, but as poems about the rhetoric of addressing the absent lover, and somehow being able to try out different forms of petitioning and approaching and so on. And I also discovered that Catullus was a translator of Sappho and admirer of Sappho and had himself used the Sapphic stanza quite a lot. And I started to use that as well. And if you haven't come across it, it's a four-line stanza of 11, 11, 11 syllables and then 4. So it has a kind of a detumescent shape on the page. Each stanza kind of deflates, so at least that's how I wanted to think of it. That it was an interesting premise to explore in the context of lyric poems about desire, not the conventional movement from uncertainty towards certainty and revelation and perhaps idealization of the beloved and distance, but the opposite. So a movement from an involvement to an embarrassment, a deflation, a deflection. Partly to acknowledge, I suppose, that the rhetoric of desire may be extremely persuasive, but it has absolutely no impact necessarily on the beloved at all. So that was another kind of experiment. So quite a few of these poems are written in Sapphic stanzas. So I'd quite like to read a couple of those now to hopefully give a sense of how they work the rhetoric of desire kind of backwards, if you like, and explore particularly embarrassment. So I think, I'm going to read a poem called 99, which it was just a kind of linguistic numerical felicity that Catullus's poem 99, which is addressed to a young boy, Juventius. It's also the name of an ice cream cone, if you're old enough to remember the 99. And from a gender point of view, that was interesting. So do I use a female speaker to address a younger female love object, which would be copying the model, if you like, or think about it as also addressing a young boy, but from an older woman's perspective. And it occurred to me that actually there aren't that many poems that do that explore a female, an older woman addressing a young man in a slightly erotic sense. But it's also about mutual embarrassment and a kind of irresolvable embarrassment at the end, I think. Yeah, okay. 99. Juventius, your coronet of red hair makes my fingers itch. I've wondered what this means. You sat behind me, I was cross-legged on the carpet like a girl, and everyone was singing for a birthday. Leaning back, I felt your breathing on my neck. A bottle got kicked over. We were sober, wine too sour for you, and I, as usual, driving. Skin, long-starved of touch, can grow obscenely sensitive. Don't you know that yet? Because I learned that as a teenager myself. I had my handful of smashed glass. Your hair burned hard against your temples as you leaned in. Girls will find your prettiness unnerving. You kissed me, Juventius, you did. It was impartial, like a burn. I felt the small sting of your curiosity as salt livens a cut. I have no answer for your cool, soft mouth, although eventually you'll bite off heartbreak sure enough, which won't be matronly, nor cut you slack for all your many charms. It's the original bitch. Each time I shifted gears as I drove home, I thought of you, how women may be brought to this. I gnaw through what's between us. You could be my child. Go forth then, kid. And the second one in that stanza form I'll read is a letter to a friend, and of course a lot of Catullus, is letters to friends, and friendship is very privileged as a relationship. And in this poem, again using the Sapphic stanza, which now that I think about it is interesting in the I liked originally its gender implications, but of course this would be a female speaker imitating a male speaker imitating a female speaker. It's kind of more complex, I think, once you look at the layers of how the Sapphic stanza has come through Catullus to me. Anyway, sorry. So this poem is where the speaker recognises, I think, that the sort of seediness of the lover. It's a famous, very famous Catullus poem where he writes to his friend and said, "Oh, what has happened to Lesbia now? She's it uses that word glubit, which I think is much discussed, just to shuck, isn't it, to shuck a corn of its skin, but basically she's tossing off the magnanimous sons of Rome in back streets. I mean, it's really nasty. Mine isn't quite as nasty as that, I don't think, but it is a moment where the love object drops from his kind of high status, and it's a connection with another woman. And it's also set in Aberystwyth, which is where I lived at the time, and it's the promenade in Aberystwyth, which is kind of tacky. And Rufus is kind of, he walks along the promenade and he talks to everybody, girls in particular. Dear Kate, weekend pavements are for pale girls. All the milk-fed daughters of our town are out, their neon eyelids flashing. They are scaring cats and setting off alarms, are brazen with their cigarettes and tampons, passing lip gloss round with strips of teeny pills. Absurdly fluent in their kissing, always kissing, oh, someone. And Rufus, strolling on the promenade, says, "Hello, Kirsty. Jess, you're looking stunning. Sam, I almost didn't. When did you become so?" What a cult of shrieks. But later, when they clatter past in tears or carry injured seagulls home in chip cartons or share a fag end on the prom, I cannot stop to think of them at our age, thickening in the cul-de-sacs of clapped-out marriages. Worse, desiccating over spreadsheets. Which side are we on now, Kate? P.S. Coffee? Soon? In my reading about Catullus, I did occasionally come across a word like glubit that had attracted a lot of critical attention, and one such word was phycellus. I think, I'm sure that somebody will correct me if I've stopped. And it's to do with, in the context of Catullus' poem 4, which is about his boat, his yacht, that is, he's now having to sort of retire it. And so it's a kind of retrospective poem, and in it he talks, apparently he uses the word phycellus, which means literally a bean pod. Bean pod? Yeah, a bean pod. Which is really lovely. And at the time I had a really old Nissan Micra, which was dark, it was black, and it was rather like driving around a bean pod. It would rattle all the time. And so that was a kind of an example of a kind of very fortuitous metaphor that actually was able to be translated into the contemporary context. The original poem, the boat, Catullus' boat poem, also references Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, as the gods that looked after the welfare of seafarers. And so I kind of wanted, again, this kind of layering of geological or kind of astronomical accuracy with a completely different but contemporary situation, and one that nonetheless was aware of its own posterity. And I had this sense, Aberystwyth being one of the places for some reason that has more CCTV cameras than anywhere else in the universe. Why? I have no idea. But that you actually can't drive through that town without being recorded somewhere on a CCTV camera. So my kind of answer, if you like, to that poem, all from this reference to the seed pod word for sellers, is micro. Catulla climbs into her small black car. It rattles like a seed pod. She is still surprised by how few of the real poets drive. She herself has ferried most of them through godless intersections to atrocious hotels. But she loves the pram-upholstered traps of cars, their quick escapes. And 9 years up and down the learning curves of motorwaves have proved that lovers in the rear view aren't that close. She's rolled 1,000 cigarettes, peeled oranges, changed clothes, cried, slept and written books behind the wheel. And now she plucks her teenage nieces from the queasy swell of sirens at a piss-up. She is sober at the masthead as her little craft is tossed from lens to lens. And who'd replay the footage of two drunk girls lurching from the curb into a car, catching behind them through a fizz of light pollution, Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri. And I'll finish with.
Yes.
Or should I finish there?
Yeah, no. Just would you like to round up? I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Just so we have time for questions.
Of course.
There'll be lots of them.
I'll finish with one long poem, which I can talk about more if anyone's interested. About that draws more on Catullus' longer poems, and in which he himself recycles a lot of Greek mythology, and which has these kind of breaks that again read like quite a modern technique, and in which he rehearses the story, well, two different stories that I'm referring to. Attis, who sort of self-emasculates himself, and the story of Theseus and Ariadne, but also which uses, by virtue of the image of a tapestry on which these things are woven, the idea of a loom. And I was very struck by this idea of a loom and weaving, obviously as a kind of metaphor for these threads being linked up. And also at the time there was something I saw on TV about rehabilitating young offenders, and there was an extraordinary scene where a woman who taught weaving and needlework had these young men in tracksuits all entranced around this loom, and she was teaching them how to there's an image of that, how to make something. Ave atque vale. But that's how it was in the old world, all its stars and seasons in cahoots. The lucky burned clean up in wars and loves. Their ash fell thick and cooled a continent. The rest of us sat tight, and by new gods rolled up, glad-handed pamphlets under doors, left drifts of cheap cologne in stairwells. Attis, for example, there's a name you don't hear much at parties. Poor, frenzied boy who split his own sex at the root and woke a lost, forked creature swaying palely in a ring of blood. Let's raise a glass to that. To Ariadne's tangled grief, refreshing daily with the tide. Aegeus at the lookout plunging seaward like a Jeroboam. Oh, heroes, brides, nymphs, Oreads, kings, gods and demigods. A pang, a dazzle, glimpsed like nipples or the whites of eyes in slack suburban twilights. Oh, like aren't we so ironic these days, lucky us. Meanwhile, a wedding, remember, with turrets and a wine cellar and catacombs. A girl who let the apple roll to the foot of a blonde-haired stranger, and wars, always wars, the din of kitchens, and the TV on three youths in regulation tracksuits standing round an ancient loom. A woman with a listen up demeanour saying something like, let axis A be time apportioned and let B, the shuttle in your free hand, leave a map of how desire tugs bright against it. Colours branch like corals, cymbals, flutes and bunting through the avenues, and always someone weeping down the dry horn of a telephone. The guests disperse. The mountains kick a moon out. Who was the man with the gold mane blowing smoke rings? What was the offering? Theseus walks out to meet the beast, poised between death and celebrity. A woman folds her house down frame by frame and deadheads all the fairy lights, for this was a garden for lovers. Cats make their bids from the flower beds. She walks out empty on the coast road. What a good ship grief is, bringing us each to her island.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are we going to
What we're going to do is move straight on to Erica, and then we will take questions immediately after. So, Erica, would you like to come up? So again, Ruth has kindly provided us with a biography, a brief biography. So I will just mention that again, I find it very interesting that both our poets are also engaged in teaching at universities, and how that kind of, whether that kind of reflectiveness has effects on the work that they produce. And Erica has published a lot of her poetry in a whole series regularly of contexts like the Times Literary Supplement or the Literary Review, the Spectator and the Strand. And you're publishing your work on Horace any minute now in spring?
Yeah,
next
in
year, right?
in spring of next year, hopefully.
Right, so we will watch out for that. And it's called...
The book is called The Country Gambler.
The Country Gambler.
I'll say a bit about it. Let me say a few words about myself before I start reading, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the book. I came to poetry when I was really young, and I have, as far as I can remember, always wanted to be a poet, but I wasn't much of a reader, when I was 8. And it wasn't until high school that I really started reading poetry. And at that time, I was only reading really Latin poetry because I had a wonderful Latin teacher. So although I was writing terrible 12-year-old poetry, I was reading the poems of Horace and Catullus and Virgil, and getting to know what poetry was through that context. I went on to university and became a classics major because I loved Latin literature, and I spent most of university reading poetry in that way. And this is the confession. Many of you are classicists or not, but I had a problem, which is that I don't have the discipline of a real classicist. It turns out it's a real shame. I'll live with it my whole life. And so as I was sort of coming into my maturity as a poet, I was also coming into my shame as a classicist. And what ended up happening was a funny kind of mixture where in order to make it through my courses, I was memorizing huge amounts of Latin poetry because I was terrified of having to translate it on the day. I hang my head, but it's true. So I would end up each week memorizing, 10 or 20 poems by Catullus or Horace or whoever we were doing at that time. And this is at the same time that I was beginning to learn how to write poetry of my own. And I think this is how it all began. I had these ancient poems in my head, this kind of straight-up translation voice, as I was also trying to figure out what I had to say as a poet. I eventually came to my senses, turned to the English department, started reading poetry in my own language, and have, not really looked back, except for that my poetic heroes are still the classical poets, and particularly Horace. So that's just a little bit about my background and how I come to this. My book, which I basically started writing then and have been writing for the past 15 years, and it's finally going to appear next year, is a book that negotiates that relationship. So as I was learning to translate Horace, I was also teaching myself what it means to be a poet and figure out what my poetic voice was. And it ended up leaning on Horace and learning from Horace. And that became a really productive conversation for me. So Horace has acted for the past decade almost like a mentor or a teacher. And the book that's resulting from it is mostly my poems, but interspersed with Horace's odes in what I hope is a kind of conversation. So I'll say a little bit about what I think I take from him, and what I hope I give to his voice, and then I'll just read you some poems. I guess the first thing I should say is I was going to say that my Horaces are really just interventions or imitations. They're very loose. Compared to Tiffany's Catullus's, they're actually not so loose. Horace retains his selfhood much more. I think he's in the book. He's in the book and I'm in the book. But of course, I'm the one giving voice to him. But for those of you who know the poems, they should sound fairly familiar. Although obviously they have my diction. They are spoken in a certain way by Erica. What Horace brings to my poetry, I hope, are some of his best qualities. So what I love about Horace, what took me from the beginning and still takes me, is his ability to be so plain, but also so intricate at the same time. There's an ornateness to his poetry, but it's also just really very simple. Part of that tension creates kind of a humor that I love. I love his funny poems. I think most of his poems are funny, and I like that. I like for poems to have jokes in them, and I like a good chuckle. It's not raucous stuff, but I mean, chuckle-worthy stuff. I love that Horace thinks that he can teach you things, that part of what he's doing is telling you how to be. I think poems don't teach us enough these days. I think we should learn lessons from them. So I try to teach lessons in my poems. It probably makes me sound horrendously, moralistic and rigid. But I think that's what a good poem does. It has a lesson. In Horace, the strictness of his forms kind of gives way to a temperamental strictness. And that is the case for me as well. So my poems are very formal, and I hope that they have taught me a strictness in my way of being. And the last thing is that Horace writes all kinds of poems. He writes poems about simplicity. He writes poems about relationships. He writes erotic poems. He writes poems of praise. He loves to write about the countryside. And those are sort of the topics of this book, too. And so there are several different modes in the book. And they come out of the modes that I've learned from Horace's odes. So that's kind of an overview of the book. And I think I'll now just spend the rest of the time reading poems. They're all short, all of them. The collection's called The Country Gambler. And it starts with a kind of invocation, which is one thing I love about classical poetry. A kind of dedication invocation, and mine is I'm sort of asking a plant to help guide me, and the plant has a conveniently Latinate name, which is the Sempervivum, and I do hope that this book will be always living. It may not be a monument more lasting than bronze, which was Horace's huge achievement, but if it sticks around for a little bit, that would be good. So Semper Vivum. Oh, one more thing I should say. In terms of, I talked a little bit about Horace's strictness of form. Horace writes, as many of you know, in complicated meters. I have developed my own modern version of the Sapphic as well. And so most of these poems are written in modern rhyming sapphics. All of the accents are not exactly the same as they are in Latin, but I still follow the 11-11-11-5 here. And I also rhyme them. I rhyme the quatrains, usually A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. And that's where the ornateness is, the plainness is in the tone. Semper Vivum. Long living plant that flowers on the ground and spawns in circles round itself, whose low and quiet center stores a gravity not surpassed by stone down to the pith, and that waits on no sustenance, but still feeds on both drought and faith. Put forth into these leaves, as with a new rosette, your not quite pink teeth, your feather white breath. That poem starts the collection before section 1. This next poem is the first poem in the collection, and it's probably the most Horatian poem of all, but it's not a translation. It's a poem. One of Horace's great abilities is to be able to try to say that we should be having a great time when he's always reminding us that we're about to die. So there's a lot of poetry about how it's all about to end. So smile and, celebrate. And this is something I can really get with. My poem is about a wonderful day I spent with my husband in Miami. And I spent most of it worrying that he was going to die. Because he will. And I had some friends a woman who lost her husband, a really young woman who lost her very young husband, and that was on my mind. And so that's what this poem is about. It seemed sort of Horatian. These are the happiest days, Miami. Under this canvas cabana, white bower of unadulterated hope, I won't tell you these are the happiest days we'll ever pass. Best not to say. Nothing will come and steal from us this hour unless it's our nagging, aggravating will to think of things always as worse than they are, to cloud up the day, as it were. Otherwise, it's in our power to spend the whole afternoon drinking our fill of sun, soaking now through the canvas over us, and even say what's on our minds a little. Because showers do come. Look at Cornelia and Raphael, just 1 second and she's lost him forever. It's the normal way of things to bloom and brighten, then turn sour. We haven't been singled out. We're not bad souls, but happiness rarely stays in place. These are the happiest days. The next poem in the collection is a translation. I call it After Horace Ode 131. And it's a poem, I'll just read it to you. It has all of Horace's charms. It's about simplicity. It's about spending your life the way, in the most modest, happy way possible. The Poet's Prayer. And I've translated this one in Sapphics as well, but not rhyming ones. What should the poet say here at Apollo's new temple? What should he ask for, pouring new wine from the bowl? Not Sardinia's harvests or Calabria's herds, not gold or ivory from the east, not even for that countryside where the gentle river lyrist grips the earth with her silent thread. The gods decide which farmer gets to trim his vines with the best Calenian blades, which merchant gets to drain golden chalices of wine just now traded for Syrian wares. A man must be held dear if he can 3 or 4 times a year suffer uninjured the Atlantic. I grow olives and endives and tender mallow. Give to me only what I am ready for, a healthy heart and a good mind, so that I may spend my final days living free from shame, playing my lyre. This next poem is one of mine. It's called Marine Display, after a display of marine life at Kew Gardens. There's this hermit crab there. I don't know if you guys have seen him. He's so appealing. This is one of these incidental poems that I think Horace has, this is in praise of the hermit crab, and, with life lessons attached. Marine Display. Blessed with his 6 jumbo-sized shoulders, the land hermit crab knows the art of the hunch, which he performs modestly so as to shuttle high parts he can't let touch the ground, a curved, fragile-skinned abdomen and such. It is no wonder, with all that body tucked up in his shell, that those buttress-shaped thighs can't step but to clutch. Meat and grip is something we all understand, who carry with us often quite a heavy load on feet that are prone to trip, which is why we love him so much. And this is another poem of mine written in Sapphics that I think I hear Horace chiding me. It's about being a good artist. It's called Swiss Painters, and I wrote it after seeing an exhibition at the British Museum, and there were 2 painters, and the thing is, one of them was really great at painting trees, and the other one was great at painting rocks. Now, they probably thought they were good at all of it, or maybe they thought they were good at none of it, but it seemed clear to me that, we have our predilections, we have our talents. Swiss Painters. Only one was good at trees, the other rocks. Except these, nothing else distinguishable between them I found. But how well one's tawny conifers did please, that shone as bright as deep, the keen brown of fox fur worn around, and from their tops could tumble down feather foliage whose dark tapestry would keep through the freeze, being winter-bound and home to mountain hawks. Splendid rocks were harder and gave him trouble. They were left for the other, who faithfully could paint with ease the rough outcrops, fissure veins, and glacier pocks. With natural gifts, anything's possible. Condescend, fair giver of these, to make me good at rocks or trees. That's the thing. Horace has these lines in the middle of his odes like, well, they're better than this, but they're like, with natural gifts, anything's possible. He always comes in for the kill at some point with what have now become cliches, but were at the time just pieces of expert wisdom. I love that. I'm going to skip this one and go to this one. This one has a real expert piece of wisdom in it. It's one of Horace's most famous great poems, Ode 1-9. I've called it the Sabine Jar. This is another one where in the middle he reminds you that we're all going to die, but he also says have a great time, and then at the end it becomes kind of erotic. The Sabine Jar. He lived in the Sabine Hills. He drank the wine. Okay. Do you see how Mount Soracte shines in the distance, white under a mantle of snow? Already now the trees cannot sustain their burdens. The stream stands still with ice. Let's dispel the cold. You pile the wood high in the fireplace, and I'll take down that Sabine jar we filled 4 years ago, and we'll stay indoors, leaving all to chance. As soon as the sea winds quiet down, the cypress too will stop, and our old mountain ash. About tomorrow, never ask. Each day's a gain. While you're still young, don't scorn sweet loves and dances. Each night in all the parks and every city square, there's secret whispering in the dark at a certain hour. And just now, in the corner of some bar, there's a girl laughing while a gift is slipping from her arm. Or is it from her finger, and she is only pretending to resist? This next poem is not an erotic poem of mine, but it's a poem about a relationship. I traveled to Greece with my husband. I hate traveling with him, and I love traveling, so it's a problem. Basically, he doesn't like to see new things, because he likes the things he knows, and I like to see new things. And that means that our trips are fraught. And that's what happens here in Corinth. It's called Corinth. If we'd sailed here on a boat and not this bus, perhaps you could love, we could love together, so blue a bay tucked down under rocky hills and those salt white bluffs. But the place has wounded only one of us, leaving a live horse and a hurt horse tethered. Just moving the same way is hard. Standing still is also proving tough. Above us, noisy gulls fuse and disperse, or gather and fly in feathered unison over worn-out earth, and sea swells suddenly turned rough. This next poem is one of my favorite poems of Horace's. It's called The Middle Way. It's so relevant, it always will be. It's Ode 10 in Book 2. The right way is never to sail too far, nor always to hug the tumbling shore when storms are gathering. For whoever finds pleasure in the middle way humbly avoids the squalor of a house in shambles and the grandeur of one inspiring envy. The tallest pine sways easiest in the wind, the highest towers fall heaviest, lightning always seeks the tops of mountains. The well-prepared heart has hope during adversity and fear during prosperity, since Jupiter brings winter back as quickly as he drives it away. Things are never bad forever. Sometimes Apollo's lyre awakens with song, sometimes it lies in slumber. Show spirit even on the worst days. And likewise, fold up your sails if they are swelling just now under too fortunate a breeze. That poem ended up being published on one of the anniversaries of 9/11, and I think it was because of the towers line, which I find strange. It is a relevant idea. On the other hand, we want to appropriate these lessons in interesting ways, and I don't know how Horace would have liked that, but the editors of the journal who published it felt that it was appropriate. So I'd better finish up. Yes, a couple more. So let me... I'll read you this one. It's two more of mine and one more of Horace. This one's called Pond. It's about a pond in Regent's Park. You know geese and how embarrassing they are. They're always making known their discomfort. There seemed to me to be a lesson in that. Unembarrassed by sound, the geese dishevel their plumes and honk. Wherever they waddle, they muddy. Never bottling up anything they feel, they spread it around for others to revel in, worry, jealousy, and joy. To bray, both wings flapping, neck elongated, chin strap exposed for a meal, seems to them wholly permissible. Their level of transparency serves over all. Bury your shame and suffer. Say it loud and you keep on an even keel. Otherwise, everything, molting or travel, flying sometimes for the full length of a day without any idea of where to stop, would be a big deal. Okay, this is the last Horace I'll read. It's really short. It's Ode 111. Everybody knows it. Seize the day. I mean, what do you do with a line like that? Even me, who's not, I'm not deviating from these poems much, but Carpe diem. Tulakonui. You should not ask the gods what end they've given you and me, for it is wrong to know. Nor should you ask the stars. Better to take things as they come, whether there are many winters left, or if this one is the last, which just now pounds the sea on giant cliffs of stone. If you are wise, strain your wines and cut short far-reaching hopes. Life is brief. As I speak, the seconds go. Hold on today. Think little of tomorrow. That poem was picked up by a blog, my first appearance on a blog, and it was Menopause Matters. I think Horace would be proud. I am really proud. They love it over at Menopause Matters, and it's about sweet surrender. I'm just thrilled. This is the last poem I'll read. This one is called Peonies. It's about death. Peonies. On an impulse, you could eat these flowers up the way they're floating stemlessly side by side like scoops of ice cream in a crystal cup. White and softly drizzled with syrup, almost creeping down from the top and shyly turning inward still. Each closed bud leaks red along the seams and gleams like a hot Sunday. What puzzles is how quickly these petals fan out, brown, flip, and fray along the edges. If only they'd stay put, if you could just keep peonies shut. Open, they frazzle.